Well, welcome everybody once again. So the, again, the focal point, the point of departure for our three esteemed guests is 1968. Now, what would that look like? Because it's three very different areas. What can we talk about? So many things in the church. We know just briefly, we've just at this time are digesting a major council, church council, where, according to your interpretation, certainly the windows were opened, adjournamento's afoot, but is it a council in continuity with the dialogues of conciliar work over the last 2,000 or so years, or is it a distinct rupture? What does the council do? There's the council, then there's, well, the work after the council. So if you're following someone like Karl Rahner, that might be his question. If you're following someone like Joseph Ratzinger, it might be, well, it's another part of the discussion. These are really not straw men, but they're polars that we can work in between. So there's that. But then what else is happening with our lives in the church? The year kicks off in '68. Lots of ways. Politically, there's the Tet Offensive, but it ends with a major figure named Thomas Merton, a Trappist monk who visits the Dalai Lama in South Asia for interreligious dialogue between the church and the East. So what Merton's doing is kind of embodying a certain way that the church is being in '68 and navigating kind of that space of both and. But it's much more complex than that, and I'll leave it to our experts to help us think about it. So we're going to begin with Father Aaron Pidell, who's from Marquette, and I'm just getting myself to you have it before you in your program, but Father Pidell is a Jesuit from the U.S. Central Southern Province of the Society of Jesus, who earned his PhD in systematic theology from the University of Notre Dame in 2017, so congratulations on that recent honor. His dissertation is titled "The Ecclesiology of Erich Schwerer, S.J., a great scholar of the Analogia Entis, and advised by the great John Betts over at Notre Dame. His interests include ecclesiology, of course, theological hermeneutics, and the Jesuit theological tradition. He is currently working on articles on Schwerer's Ignatian ecclesiology and his position on the relationship between nature and grace. So then I'll introduce, first of all, let's welcome Father Pidell. Sorry. Welcome, Father. But I'll introduce in between our other speakers. And let me get this PowerPoint up.
I like to use the PowerPoint, at least gives the illusion of preparation. Or at least what I was invited to speak on is, as you can see up here, the question of one particular theologian. So this is a way of looking at the year 1968, and as Professor Murphy was already saying, through the lens of one particular thinker. And in this case, Joseph Ratzinger is often associated with 1968 as being a figure who turned in this year. In other words, who had a progressive theological view up until this year, and then afterwards adopted a more conservative line. And we're going to visit that question, just looking at tensions in the church in general through the lens of this one particular figure. But I will say in advance that I'd like to nuance that narrative just a little bit. All right, so let me see if I can figure out how to advance the slide here. Okay, there we are. Okay, so just these are things you probably don't need me to tell you very much about. You can see all the art and everything here, but I didn't know what was going to be available. So in any case, 1968, a tumultuous year by anybody's reckoning here in the U.S. Politically, you can see the list of things, of course. Bobby Kennedy's assassination, Martin Luther King, riots regarding race in 100-plus U.S. cities. Okay. But this was also not only in the U.S., but also across much of Europe. So we can see 1968 in Germany, there was the protest of the Shah's visit, student protests against Germany, a coming to terms with the Nazi past of Germany in particular. and then various other protests regarding student conditions in universities and so forth. So all these kind of came together to form a perfect storm in 1968 in Germany as well. 1968, if we look beyond national boundaries, of course, we also have huge tensions in the church emerging, right? So this is 3 years after the close of the Second Vatican Council, which Professor Murphy was just mentioning. So a huge gathering of all the bishops in the church to chart a new course. It was intentionally presented as a pastoral council, so a new way of approaching the faith. And the question becomes, of course, as the face of Catholicism seems to change at an accelerating rate every year, there begin to emerge narratives and counter-narratives about what the council meant. And so the year of 1960 often represents a movement where two influential narratives kind of parted ways. And so you can call that, is this a year of a failure of nerve on the part of one part of the church who wants to roll back the clock, or just a year of sobering where people kind of came to their senses? Okay, and there's different ways of interpreting this, right? But in terms of the numbers, there were other big things. 1965 to 68, there's a huge decline in, especially in you might say large stakeholders in the church, like seminarians, people whose life commitments depend upon the truth of the Catholic faith, or at least would seem to be unintelligible without them. Those people are leaving the church in huge numbers right after this time. And so people are wondering what's going on, getting worried. Humanae Vitae, which, as you all probably know, is the encyclical issued by Paul VI, which affirmed, among other things, the traditional Catholic prohibition of artificial contraception, to the disappointment of many, many people. And so this was also a milestone. So in terms of whether the church was going to be a continuous voice with its past, or whether it was going to turn over a new leaf, all these questions were coming up in the year 1968. All right, so, and if anyone is looking for, let me see, an emblem of the tensions of the Catholic Church during those years, one, of course, need look no further than Joseph Ratzinger. Later, Pope Benedict XVI. And there are several reasons for this. One is that the year 1968 looms large, or at least is mentioned specifically at several points in his own biographical writings. Okay. Another is the fact that journalists have pointed to this as the year of, I quote, Ratzinger's defection from the progressive wing of the church. Okay, the year he was traumatized into attempting to close the window of Vatican II that John XXIII had so boldly opened. And the main person who I would say is responsible for the narrative is actually a writer named John Allen, who wrote both of these books up here. But the first one, which was written in 2000 before his election as Pope, entitled The Vatican's Enforcer of Faith, would especially paint 1968 as the year in which Ratzinger made his about-face. He subsequently wrote a second book, which was published right after he was elected Pope, in which he nuances this narrative quite a bit, after he was actually challenged by a theologian named Joseph Kamanchak not to engage in what Kamanchak called Manichaean journalism, where you either had good guys or bad guys, right? Good or evil, black and white. Okay. But however, the first narrative, the one where he presents 1968 as the year of the great turn, that's actually the narrative that's proved more resilient, okay, in popular reception. Okay. And so Ratzinger's, I would say, in my opinion, that Ratzinger's ostensible distancing from the progressive wing of the church reveals some movement in Ratzinger's own thinking. I think there's a grain of truth to it. But it's perhaps even more indicative, I would say, of also an accelerating movement in the progressive wing of post-conciliar Catholicism. So bracketing for the moment of which wing shifted more after the council, I think we can say that the impression that Ratzinger changed sides, becoming antagonistic to his former allies, has certainly made him a flashpoint. okay, for interpreting the council. And so Ratzinger has become a kind of Rorschach blot, for thinking about Catholics in the Vatican II era. All right. So who was Ratzinger? And what was his reputation in 1968? So by the time Joseph Ratzinger reached the year 1968, let me see, he had already, passed from being this kind of, wunderkind of German theology to this theologian of international stature. Professionally, he had already published 13 monographs of various lengths, including his Introduction to Christianity, which was published in 1968, and it was eventually translated into more than 20 languages. It was a huge sensation. And this leaves out of account the 234 shorter articles and reviews that he had published by this year. Okay, so he was a big deal, a very prolific author. During his tenure as theological expert at the Second Vatican Council, if you kind of look at what's going on at this time, he is, well, let me just say this. He has a book which is called Theological Highlights of Vatican II, which he publishes year by year with each section of the council. And so he talks about, in real time, his impressions of the council as it's unfolding. And so this is the main thing that I look at to get his impression of the council before 1968. And there, what's interesting is that he fairly straightforwardly identifies himself with what I would call the anti-scholastic majority. Okay, that there's a kind of legal and philosophical style of Catholicism, mostly written in Latin, that was in favor up until the council, and that a vast majority of people at the council thought was no longer communicating very well the faith as they saw it. And so he was certainly part of that anti-scholastic movement. And so he identifies himself in that way. And so in the reports of the council as they're unfolding, he speaks with warm enthusiasm about the new conciliar statements. He calls it a great leap forward, and et cetera. And even though Ratzinger, even at this phase, is showing some warm appreciation of the contributions of more conservative people, he always refers to them as the other folks in the council. So the conservative bloc are not his bloc, as far as he's concerned. In these same contemporary reports on the council, however, Ratzinger begins to make incisive comments that help us understand his subsequent course of development. Already in the third session of the council, Ratzinger notes the inadequacy of the contrast between liberal and conservative factions, at least if we understand these in a political sense. And it would be, he says, it would be better to speak of a contrast between historical thinking and formally juridical thinking, so this kind of scholastic thinking that he's not in favor of. And by the time we get to Schema 13, which later became the great conciliar statement on the church in the modern world, Gaudium et Spes, Ratzinger is already observing that there was no longer the old majority and the old minority. New lines are being formed to face new tasks and new problems. Part of the reshuffling of the deck had to do with the variously motivated dissatisfactions with what he calls this formal juridical thinking of neo-scholasticism. So, as I see it, there were two great calls. The two great calls of the council were, for a word that Professor Murphy's already used, aggiornamento, which means in Latin updating, okay, getting up to date with the modern world. People felt this kind of old Latin philosophical theology was not up to date. But then the other word was a French word, ressourcement, okay, which means going back to the sources. And so there were these two great rallying cries of this anti-scholastic majority. But they had slightly different sensibilities. Ressourcement wanted the Christian message to be faithful to its biblical heritage and to go back to older categories, often given by the church fathers in the Bible. Whereas aggiornamento was more interested in accessibility to the modern world. And usually these two rallying cries were allies, because most people thought that biblical ways of thinking would be more accessible to the modern world. And so they had little reason to argue with each other at this phase. And so, but as a concrete instance of how these two motivations these two anti-scholastic motivations could yield very different judgments, and began to do so, Ratzinger points to the debate over the document on missions, ad gentes, so whether the church should go out and try to convert people in or outside of Christian lands. And Ratzinger observes how the Aggiornamento crowd wanted to see in this document, later promulgated as ad gentes, a more optimistic interpretation of the meaning of world religions, because this was sort of in keeping with what they saw as a more up-to-date and attractive theology. He says, however, he notes how the more biblically oriented ressourcement crowd tended to balk at this change. He says, I quote, "The prevailing optimism, which understands the world religions as in some way salvific agencies, is irreconcilable with the biblical assessment of those religions." And this difference of judgment between Ratzinger's more ressourcement-oriented, like let's get more back to the Bible, and its worldview, versus the Aggiornamento one, begins to foreshadow what will later happen, where Ratzinger begins to part ways with people who were formerly his allies, such as Karl Rahner, Hans Küng, etc. And so Ratzinger's conclusion is, in short, what I would say a kind of, you could put it this way, it's sort of a kind of non-triumphalism. And I'll quote him from the same document. He says, I think it important that with all our satisfaction over the Council's work of renewal, that we not overlook certain ingredients of injustice, those little touches of Pharisaism, which all too readily accompany this joy over this new phase after the Council. Very much indeed did the Church need renewal, so he emphasized the renewal that was needed, renewal from within in the new situation of today. Yet it must not be forgotten that the Church has always remained the Church, and that at any time in history, the way of the gospel could be found and was found in it. And so already in 1965, we see him foreshadowing what he would later call, as Benedict XVI, a renewal within continuity. So yes, renewal, but renewal in the sense of not saying that everything that came before was a different church or vastly inferior to what we have now or something like that. Right? Anyway, the events of 1968, to get to our topic today, reveal, or I would say maybe accelerated, this parting of ways. So let me see what's next here on the Second Vatican Council. Okay, so in 1968, according to his own recollections, student revolts were highly jarring to him and his colleagues. So he, at this point, is a university professor teaching at Tübingen in the middle of all these student riots. And so in a book-length interview called Salt of the Earth, he recounts how Christian students began distributing flyers saying that Christ's passion was a form of sadomasochism, of praising self-harm and glorifying pain. Divinity students began chanting at the university, "Accursed be Jesus Christ." And Ratzinger felt that faith was suffering, as he calls it, an instrumentalization by ideologies that were tyrannical, brutal, and cruel. And this is another quote. He says, anyone who wanted to remain progressive in this context, in the sense of keeping up with where the students were and where the cultural movement was at the day, anyone who wanted to remain progressive in this context ultimately had to give up his integrity. And so his point was that though a certain kind of Marxism was very au courant, this was not the kind of modernity to which the church could easily accommodate herself without losing her own integrity and faithfulness to Jesus' mission. So in the following years, Ratzinger would take several initiatives that were highly symbolic of this parting of ways between the two different parties at Vatican II, the more Aggiornamento and the more ressourcement crowd. Not quite there. Let's see, there we go. Well, in 1969, he would move from Tübingen, which was like the most revered theological faculty in Germany, to a relatively obscure and newly founded university in Bavaria called Regensburg. In 1972, he would collaborate in founding a more ressourcement-oriented journal, called Communio. So we have two journals up here. The one on the left is Concilium, These are both 2017 issues. The one on the left or right is Communia. And Ratzinger used to write for Concilium, but I think he felt that the tone of it became aggiornamento in a way that he was uncomfortable with. And so he parted ways with that journal and decided to found a new one as as the organ for his counter-narrative. And he joined many other theologians in doing so. So Henri de Lubac, Hans Urs von Balthasar, Walter Casper, etc. And so this journal is immediately understood to be kind of competing with this other one, with Concilium. So these become powerful symbols of this parting of ways. The rest is history. Ratzinger was ordained Archbishop of Munich-Freising in 1977, elevated to the cardinalate shortly thereafter. And in 1981, he was appointed by John Paul II as Cardinal Prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, which is the office that's in charge of making sure that doctrinal orthodoxy prevails within the church. From there, he was elevated to the chair of Peter in 2005. So I guess, and so through him, one particular interpretation of the council ends up enjoying quite a bit of ascendancy during his time. But to go back to the year of our theme, what I would say is that the events of 1968 are not so much an about-face for Ratzinger as they are maybe a crystallization of sympathies already present. But I think 1968 does become a year in which I think maybe what is revealed for the first time is that this anti-scholastic majority, this group that wanted change at the council, was not entirely of one mind. That even though a great majority wanted change, many of them wanted change for different reasons. And 1968 became the moment when those different reasons became apparent. So I will conclude my remarks there.
Thanks, Father Pridell. Appreciate that. Wonderful kind of framing work. The church, of course, is not just what happens in Rome, as we know. And we're going to broaden our discussion, dialogue it in the best way to kind of create these concentric, interpenetrating encounters with, as God does in us and with us, with all of creation. So we broaden it here, I think, in two ways. Dr. Ross remembers 1968 and can speak both as a theologian and as a person who kind of came of age in that era. So it's wonderful. But let me just give you a brief bio of Dr. Ross, my esteemed colleague, a professor of theology and a faculty scholar here at Loyola. She received her PhD from the University of Chicago. From 2006 to 2008, she served as the director of the Ann Ida Gannon BVM Center for Women and Leadership here at Loyola. Dr. Ross is a past president of the Catholic Theological Society of America. She is vice president and member of the board of editors of Concilium, and which is the international theological journal that Father Pridell just showed us. And she has published numerous journal articles, books, there's not books in the program, but I'm going to mention her books. The most recent is Anthropology, is that right? Yeah. And many book chapters as well. So please welcome Dr. Ross to the podium. Thank you. Hold this if you want. Lean in, your choice. Probably holding the mic, I think, is better. Yeah, if you're comfortable.
Okay, great. Can you hear me? Yes? Okay, good. So I'll speak closely. So, yes, I was going to say, full disclosure, I was on the board of Concilium for 9 years, but I did step down actually in 2016, so I have to update my bio there, I think. So when we were talking earlier this year about this conference, I said, wow, 1968, I remember it well. And so in our conversation, Michael, I said, well, I'll talk about it, and I'll talk about how that kind of connects with issues in the Catholic Church. So I want to talk about 3 events in my own life in 1968 that also kind of have lead into a broader significance in terms of three issues. The first is sex and gender. And so that has to do with what happened when Humanae Vitae came out in the summer of '68. The second one is the question of politics, and it was my experience of the 1968 presidential election and the kinds of issues that that raised. And then the third one has to do with race and a kind of experience in terms of race relations that I'm kind of fudging a little bit. That actually happened in January of '69, but I think it's close enough to the time period here. So first of all, for sex, gender, and religion, we've already heard a couple of times, Humanae Vitae was issued July 29th, 1968. And so one of my students is here, I shared this with my class the other day, that shortly after Humanae Vitae came out, I was in this conversation with my mother, my older sister, who had just been married, my mother, who was 45 years old in 1968, and my grandmother, who was 84. So the four of us are in the living room. And my newly married sister was at that time a new member of the Navy Nurse Corps, and her husband, rather than being drafted, had opted to go to officer training school, officer candidate school. And so they were facing at least a 2 to 3 year Navy commitment that would mean some separations. And in fact, my brother-in-law was eventually sent to Vietnam, and my oldest nephew was born in Bangkok because my sister didn't want to be too far from him. So the four of us, I'm mostly listening to this conversation. So my grandmother and my mother were talking about what Humanae Vitae meant, and my sister was also wondering this. She had just been married. She's facing this future with her husband, and so she's asking, what do you think? What should I be doing? And my grandmother, who had been a convert to Catholicism when she married my grandfather, and who was also a very dynamic woman who actually supported her family during the Depression when my grandfather lost his job. She was a scriptwriter actually here in Chicago for WGN. She wrote soap operas. And so my grandmother said, you know what? What do these bishops know about the lives of married people? And my mother, who had 6 children in 9 years, starting with the first born 9 months and 4 days after my parents' marriage, she said, what are you saying, Mom? And my grandmother said, well, there are 3 of you, and they're spaced pretty well, and draw your own conclusion. And what was really interesting was my mother had no clue. And this was her daughter. And so all I'm doing is sitting there listening to all of this, thinking, wow, this is really very interesting what's going on. And I had some idea of what all of this was about, but not really taking it all in. So what this meant to me, my learning was about women's voices and experiences when it came to religion. And I should say that my own mother was a very vocal, very active woman who encouraged me to ask questions, who loved my vocation as a theologian. But she was also a very obedient daughter of the church. And so she herself followed church teaching when it came to natural family planning. And in fact, a few years later, when she and my father divorced, she met someone a few years after that and remarried, and so was in a situation of being divorced and remarried without an annulment. And being, again, a good daughter of the church, she did not receive the sacraments until a few years after that my father died, and so they were able to be married in the church. So what this said to me was something about how the voices of women were experienced and heard in 1968. And so that experience was something that I can still see myself in the living room listening to these 3 women talking about their experiences of marriage. The second event that I wanted to just say a little bit about is politics. And so 1968, so I go off to college in the fall of 1968. And as many of us remember, some of us, The presidential election that year was Richard Nixon, who had previously run, of course, in 1960, running against Eugene McCarthy. And I remember very well the whole theme of going green, going clean for Gene that year, so that the hippies were all supposed to cut their hair and clean up and go out on the campaign trail. So like the other freshmen at my college, Manhattanville College in New York, I was assigned a big sister, an upper-class student who was sort of assigned to sort of show me the ropes and be my friend and, you know, kind of share with me her experiences. And in fact, 50 years later, we're still friends. We still keep in touch. But it was very interesting in the fall of 1968 because a lot of people were very, very worked up about this election. And in 1968, and this may surprise some of the students here, the drinking age was 18. The voting age was 21. And so my friend was going to turn 21 in December. And she was furious that she could not vote in that election. And it had reminded me, though, of another experience regarding politics. 8 years earlier, my family had moved from Michigan to New York. My father's job had transferred him there. And I remember my parents being so terribly upset because in 1960, even having moved to a new state in March, in November, they could not vote. So I actually did a little bit of research about this, and I found some material that talked about a concern about voter apathy in 1960 and voter, you know, as it related to the election then. And it's very telling in terms of where we are in 2018. So I'm just reading from what I had found. Much of the blame for the relatively small vote that is customary in American presidential elections has been attributed to political apathy. However, millions of would-be voters are kept at home by legal barriers erected by the states under their power to prescribe qualifications for exercise of the franchise. Note, this is written in 1960. Requirements of residence in a state and its subdivisions for minimum periods of time before an election are impediments to a large turnout at the polls by a population as mobile as that of the United States. Many potential voters, moreover, run afoul of legal limitations, which political scientists have suggested are intended for no other purpose than to ensure the supremacy of the temporarily dominant political party. Does that sound familiar or not? So just briefly, two more things. So the residence qualifications for voting, deeply rooted in state constitutions and statutes, vary widely. A person registering to vote must have lived in the state for a specified period, which ranges from 6 months to 2 years before the election. Required prior residence in the county or town can vary. And in fact, in Connecticut, the legal requirement for being able to vote was 1 year. And so my parents were not able to vote. This, however, was thrown out in 1972. The Supreme Court decision of March 21st, 1972 declared lengthy requirements for voting in state and local elections unconstitutional and suggested that 30 days was an ample period. So, and that I just found out when I was looking up some of the things for this presentation today, which I thought was very interesting. So my learning then about this and how it had to do with my own Catholic faith and my own experience was how important voting was. But I also saw at that point how in many ways voting in politics had become also taken up into religion. And so what was your position on the Vietnam War? What was your position in terms of women's issues? All of these things were very much issues in politics then and in politics now. And so all of this is really a learning about the power of the ability to vote, how important it was, how voting regulations can disenfranchise so many people, and that the so-called voter apathy, then as now, is not really the issue when it is so difficult for some people to vote. So this may not tie in as closely with Catholicism, although I will just note, as the picture right around the corner shows, the marching of Catholic clergy and religious and many active people, including my my good friend Rosemary Ruther, who went down into the South in the 60s to get people to register to vote, is another indication of that. So the third event that I want to talk about has to do with race and race relations, racism in my own experience. So I grew up in an all-white suburb, Grosse Pointe, Michigan. It's where the only African Americans who were there during the day were maids, housekeepers, cleaning women, or waiters at the country club. They all left by 5 o'clock in the afternoon, unless they were working a party at night. And at that point, it was very interesting. If you had African American people working for your party at night, you had to tell the police. There were actually legal covenants in Grosse Pointe that forbade selling your house to people of color, which is really remarkable. And of course, this was just a year past the Detroit riots of 1967, which I lived through, and we could, from our backyard, see the red lights of all the fires in the city. So I thought I was pretty progressive. You know, I knew a lot of African Americans. Of course, they were servants, mostly, but we were friendly with them, of course. So I went to college where one of my friends was from New Orleans, and she herself identified as African American. She was Creole and came from a very large family. And my first getting to know my classmate Colette, who lived across the hall from me, was that back in those days, every college student had to pass a swimming test. So she didn't know how to swim. And so we happened to be in the same swimming class at that time, and I said, "Why didn't you ever learn how to swim?" And she said, "Because they closed the swimming pools rather than let me swim in them." So my story is this. In January of that year, there were 5 of us decided that we were going to drive to New Orleans for our winter break. Colette and her sister, and then 3 others. And we drove. I still am sort of amazed that we did this in a 5-passenger car, 5 girls driving from New York to New Orleans. We stopped in Washington, D.C. for the night, spent the night on somebody's floor. And then, of course, I naively did not think, why was it that we were going to drive straight through from Washington, D.C. to New Orleans? And I'm just thinking, well, I guess we're saving money on hotels or whatever. Excuse me. So we're driving along. I think I was partly asked to go along because I had a driver's license and some of the other people did not. So in the middle of the night in rural Alabama, we saw a 24-hour coffee place. Remember, this is 1969. And we decided to stop so that we could use the bathroom and get coffee. And I'm thinking, sure, no problem. So we get in there, the 5 of us, 2 African-American girls, 3 white girls, and we were told the place was closed. And of course, there are all these people. And I'm saying, what do you mean the place is closed? And my college friends grab me by the arm, say, shut up. And we got out of there, got to the car, and they just said, we're in trouble. And I just realized at that point what could happen. So for the next hour, we drove in absolute total silence, terrified that there was some car that was going to come up behind us, run us off the road, do whatever, shoot at us. Fortunately, none of this ever happened. But it was an incredibly learning experience for me in terms of my understanding and how I learned about race relations, or how I didn't learn about race relations from my experience. So my learning here about racism, why Colette never learned how to swim, what it was like to travel in fear, which I'd never experienced. We were very careful. We all had to agree on this. We were very careful never to go over the speed limit, to take nothing for granted. And I regret, as I look on this experience from 50 years ago, that so little has changed in 50 years. My own white privilege has continued to insulate me from so much of what the rest of the world experiences. But that night is obviously one I will never forget. So then for me, the lessons of 1968 are lessons that continue to be learned in 2018. The need and the failure of the church to listen to women's voices. And I'm reminded of what's going on right now during the Synod on Youth and all of the activist women who are pushing for a vote. the need to be vigilant about voting and political power and how fragile it is, and the continuing wound of racism and how what happened then still happens now, and worse. And my hope is that in 2068, perhaps we might have moved a little closer. So I would just conclude by saying the failure of the Catholic Church to hear women's voices in 1968 and in 2018, and I think too of the failure of the Women's Pastoral Letter, which was sort of worked on between about 1986 and 1992. In some ways, I think the co-optation of the Catholic Church and the Republican Party, some of that going back to 1968, and then also the failure of the church to focus on racism as the profound sin that it is. And there's this movement among some Catholic theologians to press the bishops to declare racism an intrinsic evil, that needs the kind of attention that other sins in the church have had. So as I said, my hope is that in 2068, we may have moved a little closer to what Martin Luther King called that arc of justice, that arc that moves towards justice. So thank you very much.
Boy, I'd like to respond to that. I'll just respond here saying that racism is an intrinsic evil. It's self-evident. Yeah. A quick fact, Yale, all male until 1968. It's 50 years. Susan talking about the beloved memory of your grandmother and your mother and your sister, talking about marriage. Let me mention today is Susan's 26th wedding anniversary, and she's with us. So congratulations to you and Bill on 26 years. It's wonderful. Okay, thank you for the wonderful remarks. My pleasure now to introduce Dr. Miguel Diaz, who is the John Courtney Murray University Chair in Public Service here at Loyola, and was selected by President Barack Obama as the 9th U.S. Ambassador to the Holy See. Professor Diaz obtained his doctorate in systematic theology from the University of Notre Dame. He is a member of the Catholic Theological Society of America and member and former president of the Academy of Catholic Hispanic Theologians of the United States of America. Miguel has an office just down the hall from me, and we often are shaking our fist at the state of the world, and then we sometimes pray together, which I think is, I like both, but I think I like the latter more since it gives me greater peace. But without further ado, it's my honor to introduce Miguel Diaz.
Thank you, Michael, and to both Father Aaron and Susan and everyone who has labored to bring together this this conference this week. So I'm going to ask the students to see if they can identify the quote that I'm going to begin my presentation. And so you get extra credit today if you happen to know where this comes from. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, and it was also the epoch of incredibility. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. We were all going directly to heaven. We were all going direct the other way. Where does that come from? Cool. Yeah. Susan, I didn't ask the students there. I asked the students, not the professors. It is from A Tale of Two Cities. But in some ways, the year 1968 has, and everything that it brings together, does speak to that both and approach and all those dimensions and upheavals, both in the positive sense and in the not so positive sense in society. And so we're kind of like returning to to where we started in terms of this panel, so I think this has worked out really well. So we've started with, the figure of Ratzinger, whom I had the pleasure of knowing fairly well because I served under the last 4 years of his papacy. And then we had Susan give us some very both personal and insightful observations and arguments related to the church, related to issues dealing with society and racism in particular. And then I'm going to return us to another figure in another major event, which will sort of like contrast with the figure of Ratzinger. And I'm going to speak about the year 1968 as providing another angle of interpretation. It provides an important signpost in the history of the Catholic Church, and in particular the history of the Latin American Church. A student unrest that took place in Germany would unsettle and reinforce the conservative evolution of a theology professor at the University of Tübingen. That professor, as we have heard already, was Joseph Ratzinger, who later became the cardinal prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, the institutional watchdog agency of orthodoxy in the Roman Catholic Church. But across this Atlantic Ocean, and in that same year, Gustavo Gutierrez, a university chaplain in Lima, Peru, delivered his famous talk to priests and laity gathered at Chimbote, Peru. That talk, entitled Toward a Theology of Liberation, would signal the development of Latin American liberation theology as a new and more historically conscious way of theologizing from the perspective of the poor and God's preferential presence and action in their lives. So keep this in mind, because we have context, we have Germany, we have Europe, we have the European, we have the protests, the student protests, and then quite a different historical context on this side, of the Atlantic. In many ways, I'll return to this at the end of my presentation, because it's sort of like 68 has caught up with us in the election of Pope Francis. The distinct social and cultural backgrounds that inform Ratzinger's Europe and Gutierrez's Latin America would take these two Catholic men along very different paths. Eventually, Ratzinger leaves behind his much-beloved world of academia. He has always spoken about that when he becomes Pope, while Gustavo Gutierrez engages more and more the academy, even while he remains committed to solidarity with the poor. The worlds of these two men could not be more different, and the social movements and ecclesial experiences they each faced that deeply shaped their thoughts and ecclesial commitments could not be further apart. Ratzinger and his allies would watch over the suspicion and development of Latin American liberation theology, and at times even question its orthodoxy, as the 1984 instruction on certain aspects of the theology of liberation in the 1986 document on instructions on Christian freedom and liberation exemplify. In my brief remarks this evening, I just want to bring to all of us for some food for thought around liberation theology, and underscore the fact that it is Latin American liberation theology is but one expression of manifold liberating theologies that have emerged since the Second Vatican Council that have taken very seriously particular human contexts in order to discern and interpret what the Council called the signs of the times. And yes, interpret these signs in light of faith, revelation, and Christian theological traditions. With respect to Latin American liberation theological traditions and interpretations, I want to highlight three things tonight. First, the preferential option for the poor. Two, the very methodology of Latin American liberation theology. And three, the relationship that Latin American liberation theologians argue between salvation and liberation. These are three essential key elements, and one cannot understand 1968, especially from a theological perspective, and what has followed without, I think, understanding these three elements. First, the phrase option for the poor was actually first used in 68 by Pedro Arupe, the Superior General of the Society of Jesus, in a letter he sends to the Jesuits of Latin America. And as we all know, this has become a catchphrase associated with this theology. The principle, which is thoroughly rooted in Scripture, Exodus 22, Leviticus 19, Isaiah 58, Matthew 25, Luke 6, 20 to 23, just to cite a few examples, received much attention in official Latin American church documents, beginning with Medellin in 1968, and later in Puebla in 1979. The option really synthesizes the fact that precisely because God's love is inclusive, and because God wills the good and salvation of all peoples, no exceptions, God necessarily and preferentially must side with the oppressed and the marginalized. As I've always shared, I have 4 kids, and if the little one is left out, I necessarily must side with the one that is weakest. It's not because I love the little one more than I love the other 3. It is because there's a certain principle of justice that immediately and instinctually leads me to defend the one who is most vulnerable, the one who is most at risk, the one who is most likely to suffer the consequences of privilege, power, etc. This option, as liberation theologians never tire of arguing, is a theocentric option. It is God's option for those most in need, reflected in the Hebrew Scriptures and in the Gospels. It is the central ethical commandment that defines the followers of Jesus. Then the righteous will answer him, quote, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty, or give you something to drink? When did we see you as an immigrant on the way north in a caravan and invite you in, or naked, or clothe you? When did we see you sick in prison as a result of racial injustices and come to you?" The king will answer and say to them, "Truly I say to you, to the extent that you did it to one of these brothers of mine, even the least of them, you did it unto me." Matthew 25, the great judgment scene. At Medellin, the bishops called for sharpening, quote, "the awareness of our duty of solidarity with the poor." That translates, they continue, into making our own their problems and their struggles, end of quote. Second, methodologically speaking, Latin American theology seeks to discern, so Jesuit in some ways, seeks to discern God's presence in human history and to discern ordinary and daily human experiences that facilitate encounters with the God of life, or with those sinful experiences that hinder such encounters. Gutierrez provides the classic definition of Latin American liberation theology as, quote, "critical reflection upon Christian praxis." Theology, as Gutierrez argues, rises at sundown. Theology must be done in service to life, especially the lives of the poor and marginalized. Theology stems from the liberating praxis of following Jesus. In Latin America, to follow Jesus is costly. It demands that Christians confront the idolatry of money and power and the scandal of material poverty that condemns the majority of peoples to death. Latin American liberation theology moves away from simply addressing human development and instead calls for policies and historical mindfulness and approaches that bring about human liberation from oppression. Theologically put, Christian theology, argues Ignacio Ellacuría, must reflect not only on the history of salvation, so let's take a class on Jesus and the Gospels, and let's take a class of the history of Christian theology and the doctrines that have shaped that theology. That's important, that's essential, but that's not enough. Christian theology must also reflect on the salvific character of historical acts, so as to explore which historical acts bring life, salvation to human beings, and which bring condemnation. Which acts make God more present, and how that presence is actualized and made more effective in them or not. Third, liberation theologians understand liberation as an all-inclusive saving event that transforms all forms of sin and challenges all forms of sin, not just personal, but social, structural, etc., and moves towards an integral human understanding of freedom and development and liberation. Latin American liberation theologians readily admit that liberation from social political oppression, from economic oppression, and other forms of human oppression, it's not all that God's salvation is about. Ultimately, it is God's gift. It is grace. But that grace and that gift requires a human response. Because just as the Council of Chalcedon, students, 451, declares that humans and divine realities are distinguishable in the very reality of Jesus, and related to each other but never separated in Him, the acts through which God liberates and saves persons in history can never be separated from one another. To liberate it is to give life, in every sense of the term. It is God's presence in the world. In this integral approach, liberation theologians affirm, quote, the church is of the world. It's in the world in a certain sense that the church is the world. The church is not non-world. It cannot be. It is human. It is incarnational. It is part of God's presence. At times. At times not. As a result of the election of Pope Francis, the first Latin American and the first Jesuit Pope to the See of Rome, that's the Bishop of Rome, the Church has moved closer, perhaps, to the vision of Medellin, and that set forth in terms of Latin American liberation theologians. Institutionally speaking, that is. Approaching, in some ways, Medellin's option for the poor. In fact, Pope Francis's thoughts right before his election are now widely cited, and I quote, this is Pope Francis. During the election, I was sitting next to the Archbishop Emeritus of São Paulo and the Prefect Emeritus of the Congregation for the Clergy. A good friend. When things started to move in a dangerous direction, he comforted me. And when the votes reached the 2/3, there was the usual applause, because I had been elected. And then he hugged me and he kissed me and told me, do not forget the poor. And that word made an impact on me, the poor. The poor. Immediately I thought of Francis of Assisi in relation to the poor. He becomes the first named pope to take the name of Francis. Notwithstanding the efforts of countless prophets like Saint Oscar Romero, whose canonization we just celebrated a week ago, and who paid a dear price on behalf of advancing human dignity and justice in Latin America, the price of his very life. Medellin's invitation to sharpen the awareness of our duty of solidarity with the poor in order to make our own their problems and their struggles remains an unfinished historical project. As Latin Americans and their Latino siblings here in the United States would say, la lucha continues, the struggle continues, to point out poverty, lack of adequate health care, systemic and institutional discrimination, violence, and the marginalization that faces the daily lives of thousands of Latin Americans and all of our American neighbors. As the recent images of desperate Latin Americans on the move south of our border continue to remind us, the poor will resist being erased from history and from our human consciousness. And poverty, as Latin American liberation theologians would readily admit, continues to rear its ugly head in oppressive and hybrid human experiences related to persons rendered indecent on the basis of their gender, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, religious identity, documentation, physical ability, and other similar but oppressive human experiences. As we commemorate the year 1968 with its prophetic figures and transformative movements, we might best honor the memory of Medellin by committing or recommitting ourselves to opt for the poor, embracing the oft difficult task of speaking truth to power. The reflections and actions that ensued during and after this historical moment in the Church of Latin America invite us to resist and denounce whatever diminishes the dignity of human persons, especially those Caribbean and Latin Americans who have been stereotyped and dehumanized within our own borders and by our own political leaders as coming from the shithole countries of this world. As Christians, we must shape our sunsetting theology with that sunrise praxis that declares that the stone that the tower builders of this world have rejected has become our cornerstone. Thank you.
The shithole countries, that comes from the president. That was not Dr. Diaz. That's a quote from Donald Trump. Okay, we have time for some response from the crowd, some questions. Anything you want to push back, you want to support, you want to clarify, please feel free to respond. I can begin, and you can marinate. This is for Dr. Ross. People are giving up on institutions. Politics, you mentioned about voting in your talk. The corporations in many ways haven't helped workers, or banks haven't been too helpful to people in some ways. The church has not been helpful in many ways. I was talking to one of our student workers about church attendance. That was you, Emily Kate. And we had 400 with regularity at Madonna at the student mass. It's like 75 now. And this is like overnight. I know, Susan, you've thought about this. Why do you stay in this church? It should be on. Is that too personal?
No, it's, it's a question that I've been asked quite a few times. I actually told the story to my class the other day of the fact that I have been invited to 5 weddings this year with all of the young people who got married. They were all raised Catholic. And I asked the class, how many of these weddings do you think were Catholic weddings? 0. Yeah, that's true. And so why do I stay? I ask myself that actually a lot. Part of it is inertia, in a sense, because part of it is that I'm part of a community. I am part of a worshiping community that I complain about. There are things about it I really don't like. But in a sense, that's partly why I do, is because it's not all, well, my answer in a sense is, it's not all about me. That's for one thing. And I don't know where else you're going to be challenged to think about these issues. How it is that you live with your neighbor, how it is that you think about the gospel. I'm sort of forced to think about these things when I listen to a homily, even if it's not very good, but I'm fortunate to go to a place where it's mostly pretty good. And so there's, for me, a kind of need to have some place that will keep prodding me. And you can do this in all kinds of ways. And, I have to say, so in relationship to the students here, when I was in college, I didn't go to church. I mean, I was, it was that time of my life. I think a lot of people, just kind of think, why do this? And so, and I've been in and out in some cases. At one point, I had a kind of Lutheran sojourn for about 4 years. And actually, this story's longer than I will tell here, but we were married. My husband and I were married by a woman Lutheran pastor for all kinds of different reasons. Later on, we did have the marriage blessed in the church. But there is something about the work that the church does that is very good, that I have seen around the world. The people that have taught me, mostly very good people, and the people that the church has served, even among the people that the church has brutalized. And so I think for me, it's a thread of hope that something of that gospel message, something of that community, something of that relationship with whatever that divine reality is kind of source of nourishment for me. And I think, but a lot of it for me is that need for a community. And I know I could find it in other places, but this is the one I kind of know the best.
Want to respond to that, or yeah?
So I was the one who brought up the attendance thing to Dr. Murphy, and
Yeah.
I see the numbers so vividly because I'm a member of the choir at the 9 p.m. Mass, so from the choir loft, it's very easy to see the fluctuating numbers. But the thing that I'll comment on is that we've seen the highest amount of attendance in terms of choir members, servers, and readers at Mass. And so I want to kind of open this up to the whole panel, but also just to respond to your own answer, Susan. Do you think that being part of a community, I think too, I read Intro to Christianity, Ratzinger's 1968 book, and there was this concept of the symbolum. We're all like a part of a bigger community, and we all play a really important role in that community. And so like, how do you see being Catholic unique to being part of this community? And then, like, additionally, what about playing a role in the liturgy or in conversations about faith when we feel empowered? Do you think that plays, or how do you think that plays a role in someone's personal faith life?
Yeah. Well, I'll just answer really briefly because I want to give my colleagues here something to say. Actually, this may sound like it's going against what I was just saying, but with this whole discussion of whether or not women can have a voice at the Synod, because some of you may or may not know that at the Synod on Youth that's going on right now, that there are some religious brothers who were elected by their congregations, and in fact, they were given a vote. And there are women representatives there who have no vote. And my frustration with that, and my frustration with, 68 years of, being part of a church that values women in many ways, but does not really want to have women have a voice. I said to my husband, maybe the only way that I can respond to this is by cutting my contributions, And I'm quite serious about this, that in fact, how else can I get my voice heard? So in some ways I refuse, I have all kinds of respect for the people who have decided, and I know many of them, who are Episcopalian or Lutheran or whatever at this point because they're so fed up with all of this. And I think I'm probably too old to change all of that right now. But there are ways in which I think, and I would want to tell this to my pastor, because one last little thing. When I started I go to the Shield Center up in Northwestern. I started going there in part because the one Sunday that I was ready to give up on church, there was a woman preaching. And I thought, damn, that sounds good. Well, about 7 years after that, some of the undergraduates in Northwestern complained to the Archdiocese that they actually allowed a woman to preach, which is not canonically permitted. And so, no, there are no women preaching. That hasn't happened. And so part of it is also that, I would want to say that that's part of my protest too. So I'm part of a Facebook group that we've just been sort of debating. Is there a group for women who want to say, yes, we're here, but we're not going to shut up, or something like that? So that's kind of my sense, if that helps your question.
Yeah, Father Aaron or Dr. Diaz, any thoughts on?
Susan's,
Click on the, sorry.
On the top.
Yeah.
There you go.
Apologies. Yeah, it should be good.
yeah, it's just, I taught the course last semester. I'm teaching it again this semester to honor students in Latin American Liberation Theology, but I did teach a course to graduate students in last semester. And it was interesting during a couple of the discussions, students, Catholic and Protestant, because in some ways the Catholics don't have a monopoly on this issue of marginalization and oppression based on various human experiences, shared very honestly and frankly their struggles to remain active in actively participating within their, whether Catholic or Protestant churches. And it's interesting because, it oftentimes has to do with this issue of a certain group of persons or normativity or privilege, et cetera. But I heard stories across the board which were very inspirational, but at the same time very troubling, of African American students, feeling, as alien or as not welcomed in their own churches. I've heard I heard queer students with the same stories. I've heard women, the undocumented, who are fearful that the church can even become, or someone in the church can become a place that turns them in, And so I think this is a real issue, and it's just, for most of us who go to Sunday worship, we're just too comfortable, and it's really difficult for me to go to churches where, we have such big social challenges that confront us, and in my book, they're life challenges. And they're not even, these issues are not even mentioned as, I mentioned Matthew 25 because to me it always speaks that, okay, how can we be a Christian and deny the suffering, regardless of where that suffering is coming from my next door neighbor? And yes, it literally could be your next door neighbor. There are people all around you who are in pain and suffering, and we just turn our heads around and our bodies walk the other way, and it's. So I just think it's, a couple of weeks ago I went and served some meals at the Halstead Center, that's on Halstead, for young men and women like you. And these are LGBTQ young women, college age and younger, who have been kicked out of their homes simply because of their humanity. And I sat there and I said, how can this continue to happen in America? How can this continue? And how can the churches be silent to this kind of suffering and to this kind of dehumanization? That's just one experience of the homeless in our streets. And it's just happening, right? Blocks from here. And so, again, it's, I just want to echo what Susan was saying. This is a serious issue. And to me, it's not so much how can we, is there a God, but what kind of God do we believe in? Are we believing in a God of, of privilege and power, and where are we locating God's presence? And it was nice because I did go to a different church this past Sunday just to hear a different kind of message. And the Lutheran pastor actually preached on what it means to be great. And he used the example of compassion and kenosis and self-emptying, as a primary lens through which to examine greatness at our time. And I said, wow, I need to hear more of this, because if I don't get this, I die.
Thank you. Father Pidell, did you want to say anything on this? I have a question for you if you want to hold on, or you could speak to this. Both, it could be both and.
Yeah, let me just say briefly that, I kind of love being a member of the Catholic Church, as you might have guessed, and but which doesn't mean that that I think that the Catholic Church is always just, especially in the way that it treats people. But in addition to all the things that Jesus said about justice and care for the poor and all those things, he also said things like, unless you eat my body and drink my blood, you won't have life within you, etc. And for me, that's, the reason I'm in the church. I mean, mostly it's just that I think it's important for me to have, first of all, a community that's not of my own choosing, okay, whose rules were not made up by me or chosen because they reflect the affinities I've already developed or something like that. But in some ways, nobody gets the church they want. Yeah. And I think it's an important thing for me to be stretched by that. But then, and also, not only is it important for me to be stretched, but it's also important for me to get the strength to be stretched. And I do think that despite all of its manifest faults, that at least in my reading of it, Jesus wanted people joined into a community where they could eat his body and drink his blood. Yeah. And as long as he wanted it that way, then that's the way it'll be for me. I think that's what it comes down to.
I can follow up on that point. So I'd say just personally, it's like I can't, it's like leaving your family. I could no sooner leave my family than I could leave the church. And with the imperfections, Pope Benedict, Father Benedict now, his theology of the church won't be this, never a utopia, but it won't be fully itself until the so-called end times. Until then, it contains everybody. It lacks perfection, like our families. So, and then for me, my own intellectual framework, my own theological training, for what you say, helps me with that. The question that was framed to an audience that Charles Taylor would say is raised on what he calls exclusive humanism. From 1968 on, that the option for theological thinking or engagement just becomes another option among many, just another discourse. And that's in departure than the kind of church maybe that your mother grew up with, Susan, or that kind of reality. So to your ears, you're a younger person, Aaron, and you've chosen this, or you were chosen for this. What do our young people, how do you think about being churched? Or if church is too much of a loaded term, how do you think about being drawn to something that your deepest desire of your heart, or something that really matters that's more than you are? So I want to just ask you that, and maybe you can respond if I can engage the crowd or anybody else. And then also say that, maybe, I don't want to muddle this too much, but I will say that even Ratzinger, this is where it might stick with some people. The Communio crowd that you refer to, they're really good with theology and culture, but they don't like theology and politics so much because of the eschatological scope of the church. So the signs of the time for them is the incarnation of God. They're not going to pay attention, or they're uncomfortable with paying attention of the cry of the poor on 4th and Vine in Los Angeles, right? That might be a different engagement. So, and the Concilium wants to engage culture in that way. It's a straw man argument, but that's where some things can slow down for that kind of high theological, high liturgical, high maybe body of Christ church that's always engaging with culture and always taking care of. That's just the work of the church. But then they don't want to be subject to every whim like what's happening in 1968. That's very muddled.
Michael, can I just add one other, just to keep adding complexity to the ongoing. Another issue when it comes to the church is, especially for those of us that have Latin American roots,
Right.
is that because of the history of the clergy and the church in Latin America, you know, and even the number of indigenous, for instance, or priests that were particularly coming from the distinct countries, et cetera, communities of Latin America.
Yeah.
And that's also the case in the United States. When you look at, you know, for instance, Latino priests, you know, Latinos have, and Latin Americans have for a long time had a history in which they had to develop their own ecclesial communal traditions.
Absolutely.
A lot of those traditions developed around women, grandmothers, et cetera, in the home. And so it's really those persons that have been most responsible for, you know, for passing on the faith. Now, in a parish-like structure in the United States, you know, there is no doubt that many of them have felt unwelcome for a number of reasons, and they have had to find alternative communities, or they have literally left the Catholic Church. Because in some ways, I mean, and I love your examples of both of you saying, well, you know, I would never leave my family, I would never leave the church. But for many of them, it's not that I wanted to leave. The church and my family left me.
Yeah.
They abandoned me. They basically
Yeah.
threw me out on the streets as a homeless person.
Yeah.
And I needed to survive with a family that would, you know, embrace me. And so I think that's a lesson to be learned too, because it's not just that it's people want to leave the church,
Yeah.
it's what are the social, cultural, religious, whatever conditions that either enable or kick people out. And people, and I think that if we theologically understand that the Holy Spirit blows where she wills, you know, we're not gonna, you know, the Holy Spirit is not gonna wait for a Catholic institution to respond to that. I mean, I had a conversation with Walter Casper at one point on this issue, and, you know, he was very, very open to the very fact that, yes, I mean, this is a reality. We had a conversation in light of the Latin American situation.
Hans Urs von Balthasar says this, literally, the Spirit is empowered to utter a fresh and central answer to every situation.
Amen.
That's a communio theologian. My follow-up for you is right up the street. What does the U.S. church miss when they ignore how other American churches, Latino American churches, how they think about being church, or how they think about spirituality?
I mean, I don't obviously want to ever, it's like saying that all white Americans or African Americans or men or women or whatever think in the same way. So I think there's tremendous hybridity, diversity, and richness in all the communities, whether we speak about Italian Americans or Irish Americans or whatever. I mean, but I do think that the church is, I mean, as a general, in some ways, you know, the Latino already comes with some equipped hybridity, because our identities have been shaped by movement, by dialogue with African and indigenous traditions, that those traditions have had some impact on the way that our Catholic roots and our Catholic traditions have unfolded. I mean, there's a dark side of the Spanish conquest, and there are also positive dimensions. I mean, there's also the hybridity of the Islam, Jewish, and Catholic Christian roots that has some impact too on my ancestors, and then the African presence, and so all those things I think are potential, not to be raised to some kind of idealized state, but they're all, because many of us are not even conscious of that, because as some of my friends have said, you know, none of us, and I went through the school system in the States, none of us had even mentors who looked like me. You know, I never had a mentor who looked like me in theology or in other areas when I attended the different, and so in some ways, even some of our students have never heard about, you know, Latin American authors or Latin American traditions or Latin American thinkers or, you know, Juan de la Cruz, Teresa of Avila, I mean, these are people who are to a large extent, and so I think that drawing from the well of those resources can only but enrich us, and can only but in this age of where at least I think that either we act in interdependent ways or we're going to all perish. You know, I think in this day and age we need to build bridges, not walls. and I literally mean not just physical walls, but, relational bridges and relational walls, because otherwise we're going to perish, and everyone's going to perish. It's not just one country or one group of persons, so.
Well, thank you, and the Pope's not called a pontifex for, I don't want to press the students, you guys have had a long day, we all have, but is there a community that would address your heart's deepest desire and maybe even test you and maybe even tell you that, maybe challenge your point of view? Is there one you associate with? Or do you think, maybe this is rhetorical, but I'd love to hear if you have an answer, maybe we select our own communities and we select our own enclaves, whether online or not? Are we just so individualized that way that we just atomize that out? But do you have a sense of community? Anybody want to say anything about that? Nope. It's all right. You have the last word, sir. They're intractable. If I was in class, I'd have other methods, but I'm not going to push.
All I was going to say about the sense of community, Susan, you addressed it, Miguel addressed it, and you addressed it in terms of the people who participate in the church. I think a lot of people, when they get to college, drift away from going to church because suddenly nobody's telling you have to do that in the morning. And I certainly went that route. And then when I tried to find my way back, I just kind of drifted from one church to another, including the Unitarians, which if I understand the definition, it's atheists that just can't give up the church habit. But the way that I actually found my way back to the church is when I came to Chicago to work with a religious group, Little Brothers of the Poor. So again, it was working in community with people, a little bit like you were saying about if you're doing Christian ministry through the church or something, or Miguel, if it's a social cause, when there's some sort of a living out of your faith and being active in a community, I think that can make all the difference in the world for living out your faith. It's also striking to me that the word parish and where churches are dying in parishes are so close together.
And I'm not trying to evangelize, let me be honest there. I'm just saying, what is it? Because we're all hungry for something quite deep. Do you want maybe you have the last word, Emily? Yeah. Yeah.
My mom made a point. My mom made a point. She had always been forced to go to Mass growing up Catholic. She spent time in the 90s when she was in college not going to church. And her and my father were not married originally in the church. And then it was something when she had children, she decided to go back. And so then she made it her mission in raising my sister and I, who my sister also is here at Loyola. And it's been really nice going to Mass with my sister, that it was our choice. It was a decision we could make, and it's something that she said her mother and herself and her mother's mother never had the option. It was the family goes to Mass, so it's time for you to go. And so I would say that's something maybe different with our generation, is that I don't think our parents were as forceful in terms of giving us a faith. And for me, I mentioned empowerment. It's something that's been very empowering in my own faith life, that this is my decision. I didn't just inherit this. It's something that I'm owning. So I would say that's like a really important part, and that's something that we've seen only changing since Vatican II, really, and only shifting after 1968, I would say.
If you stay over, I really do appreciate it. We'll hear from back here, then we'll, thank you for your indulgence, 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, kind of going off of that. I guess I can contribute to this conversation in that I think maybe 2 to 3 years ago, I was baptized and confirmed Catholic. So this was something that I was kind of left out with as a child. I mean, my family, my dad was raised Lutheran but born Greek Orthodox. So he was kind of all over the place, and then he just kind of shifted away, and my mother was never part of it. So it wasn't like religion was out of the question. It was never talked about. And then I think it just came to a certain point where, and I look at things like this in my family dynamic today, and talking about homelessness. I am recently homeless as well, and had to find a living situation with some other family members. But my family is very fragmented, and not only on the religious aspect, but every aspect. And so I think one of the major reasons that I approached becoming a Catholic was, I guess, just the pursuit of knowledge. And that's just something that I think, and I was just always raised without it. And I think just looking forward on into the future and I guess the life that I want and the family that I guess I want to start in the future, I think it's something that it's not necessarily a sense of community for myself as it can be, I guess, for my peers and things like that. I mean, it's just one of many communities that young adults are a part of and that they have like that choice to kind of associate with that. But I think I look at it more of, yes, it's a satisfaction of the desires that I have right now, but more of looking down the road and saying, you know, I don't necessarily want to have a family that is as fragmented as mine. And even if it happens to kind of be that way, or, you know, my children or my family just isn't what I envision it, which it never is the case, I guess going to the church is something that I can rely on and know that it could be a stabilizing factor, and it's something that, like, yes, I can kind of bring this community into my house that I guess a lot of people could associate with. Because like I said, I look at myself in relation to my family, and I think very differently. I am very differently. And I have a lot of different goals than a lot of the other people in my family do. And so I think like this was allowing me to find a community that, yeah, there's other people that think like me and kind of pursue and desire the same things that I do. And that's something that I could infuse into a family that I choose to start one day.
Thank you.
Megan? No? Okay. I think we've come to our time then. Would you join me in thanking our esteemed panel? Thank you very much.